Story number 1. I had a member of staff, M, try to force himself onto another staff member, F. She chose not to press charges. That didn't sit right with me. To preface, I live in a country that employs a large foreign/expat workforce, in pretty much every industry and in all levels. For someone to move here for work, they have to be sponsored by a company or the individual that's employing them. I own and operate a small restaurant business here and employ more than a handful of foreigners as servers, cleaners, kitchen staff, drivers, etc. So here's the story. I was lounging on my couch enjoying the last of my weekend one day when I get a call from telling me that one of our sponsored employees, a server, let's call her Janice, was picked up for indecent exposure essentially. Long story short, she was caught hooking up with a guy in a private booth at a local restaurant. Basically, the police walked in on them whilst engaged in some seriously heavy petting. They were fully clothed, but the guy she was with, or practically on top of I should say, has his junk out. Turns out he works at the restaurant 2 doors down from where she worked. After a bit of chastising and threatening to escalate the situation and have them deported to sufficiently scare their senses back into them, they let them go, but not before signing a pledge-type document promising to never repeat the offense, or else. A slap on the wrist basically, and everyone got to go home. But it doesn't end there. That night something clicked in my brain and I had the thought, how and why did the police find them in a private booth in the back of a restaurant before the restaurant's own staff did? So I called the restaurant the next day. I thought maybe they called the police on them immediately for some reason. Or maybe the couple got belligerent when staff asked him to stop. Turns out the staff didn't notice a thing. In fact, up until that day the police have never been to that restaurant before, and when they did they simply walked in, went straight to the back booths where the two were sat and busted right in. I realized this meant that someone must have seen them and called the cops on them point blank. The question was who? I decided to speak to Janice. I wanted to speak to her anyway that day, both to check in and get her version of the situation. I also gave her the employer, you did something stupid chat and reassure her that she's keeping her job. I also wanted to ask her who she thought called her in. Without hesitation she said it had to be Sammy, who was one of our drivers. Why do you think it was Sammy? I asked. He's the one that dropped me off at the restaurant that day. He might have seen my friend walk in right after me and called the police on us, she said. I knew the part of him dropping her off was true, that literally his job and her only free mode of transport. Well, that sounds a bit drastic. Why would he do that even if he had seen you do anything? I asked. She claimed it was because he was jealous. He was really into her apparently and kept trying to get her into bed, she said. What genuinely pissed me off was when she told me that he actually tried to force himself on her once and she fought him off, and that he hasn't tried or even said anything since other than be very short and curt with her. My immediate response was, why on earth would you not tell me or one of your managers right away? She said she had dealt with it her way, and it stopped, plus she didn't want anybody to get fired on her account, and she didn't want any interaction with the authorities, so she decided not to make a big deal out of it in the first place. She also declined to press formal charges against him, which I advised her to do. Her declining infuriated me even more. This guy was going to get off scot-free. Now clearly, I was about to fire Sammy, but in my mind that wasn't enough. For someone to attempt to rape a person basically and not get in trouble for it? Not okay with me. But it seemed like it was something I had to live with. Obviously, my next conversation of the day was with Sammy. My intent was to confront him with the accusations. I called him into my office. I didn't really know where to start, so I went with, obviously you've heard about what happened to Janice this weekend. He stepped in it right away. Heard about it? Came the unexpectedly proud response from a proud AF and positively beaming Sammy. I called it in. And this is where it started to get super satisfying. You see, for a couple of years since I met Sammy, every now and then he would pull out and show us all pictures of his wife, who was back home living with his mother. She was younger than him and quite beautiful, but sadly barren, which is apparently why she settled with an older fart like him. He was so proud of how pretty she was. He was also a devout religious man, or so he claimed. So, I asked, and why call the police? He came back with, after I dropped her off, I waited to see who she was meeting because she's a troublemaker woman. When I saw the man walk in after her, I call police because I know him and he is married and this is against the laws of God and man. I'm smiling now, I knew I got him. Why do that instead of calling your direct manager, or even me, and before even seeing for yourself what they were doing exactly at that? Why make it my problem and the company's problem what she does in her own time? Silence. Head down counting his shoes. Sammy, I know why. I know what you did. Janice just told me. I'm disgusted by you and sorry that we hired you. He had the audacity to mumble, I only tried once, sir. I almost slapped him. Anyways, I fired him, handed him a one-way ticket home, which was in 4 hours, and told him to GTFO. This is where I get my not-so-petty revenge. I had his house phone number saved somewhere from we hired him. It was on his CV. I knew that because I called him there to interview him before we first hired him. I waited until his flight took off and dialed the number. I assumed either his mother or wife would answer the call, but I was wishing for the latter. I got my wish. Hello, Mrs. Sammy. I'm your husband's employer. Well, his former employer anyway. Just so you know, I fired him a few hours ago and he's on a flight home as we speak. His flight number is XXXXX. He will be arriving at XXXX. Just so you are aware, I was forced to fire him because he attempted to rape a fellow employee half his age. I'm sorry, I said, and promptly hung up, but not before hearing her gasping in shock. Story number 2. Try to steal my legally rented parking spot. Enjoy being unemployed. This happened last night. I am now in a good enough spot to actually post this. I'm not quite sure if it qualifies as pro, but it definitely isn't petty. I am a professional driver. As such, on the roads in the US, there are different truck stops throughout the country that has a pay-to-park system, usually about 10 to 20% of the lot marked off as reserved, with each space running from $15 to $25. The truck stops where this took place had parking for $17, which is relatively cheap, for a guaranteed spot. The spots are reserved for 24 hours, starting at 4 p.m. local time, and extending to 3 p.m. the following afternoon. I knew that I would have a late-night delivery, so I came to the truck stop around 3:30, and paid for a reserved spot. I told the manager on duty that I had a delivery up the road that night, and would be back once delivery was completed, but should still be able to clear out the spot by the next afternoon, today. She told me that this was okay, and she would mark the spot as sold when I left. That way, if someone else comes in trying to reserve that spot, she could consult her notes and deny the sale. 11:15 p.m. rolls around, I take off for my delivery. I don't get out of that facility until 2:30 a.m. the next morning, this morning. So, I groggily drive back to the truck stop to reclaim my paid-for spot, only to find that the reserved parking spaces are all full. I call the manager on duty, and after giving her my info, inform her that all the spots are full, and that someone has parked in a spot and hasn't paid for it. She sends her other employee out to start checking trucks. The culprit was from a company that is known for their bright orange trailers, and he was a company driver. The other employee starts banging on his door to inform him that he is parked illegally, and he has to move. Meanwhile, I can see the commotion from my mirror, with my vantage point in the fuel island, where I had been instructed to temporarily park. The driver answers the door with a bottle of Heineken in one hand, and some sort of smoking implement in another. I know what it is, but for the sake of the mods, I'm not going to say it. I decided to roll down the window to hear the commotion, and I hear the employee tell the driver to either move, or he will get the towing company and police involved. This driver is flat out irate that someone had the audacity to tell him where he can and cannot park, so he slams the door on the employee, threatening him. Employee calls the police and tow company, and the police show up first. I had worked for this company before, so I know their policies, and more importantly, what they can and cannot have in their trucks. Alcoholic beverages are not allowed in the cab. Anything that isn't a cigarette or a cigar and a lighter, also, not allowed. The coup de grace, a pew-pew, of any kind, absolutely not allowed, and especially not allowed loaded. This driver had all that, and some other not-so-legal substances in his cab, so he was hauled away in cuffs. His truck was hauled away on a wrecker. I made a call after the commotion died down to the company's safety director, and informed them that their rig will be in an impound lot, and their driver is going to jail over the not-so-legal stuff he had in his truck. She thanked me, and said that he will definitely lose his job, especially over the alcohol and the other not-so-legal stuff. I guess he played the screw around and find out card, and it bit him in his career.